we support an attempt to raise the debt limit that raises people's taxes. That we don't want to do. And so again, I am cautiously optimistic that we are moving forward so as to come to some agreement that meets those guidelines, and I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his comments. I would respectfully note that so much of what he talked about was resolutions. I think resolutions clearly do state an opinion. Whether or not they have any ultimate effect is to be seen. I think the American public, in looking at the agenda the gentleman has just gone through, probably says to themselves, well, we don't see the jobs in that agenda. We do see the agenda in that agenda. We do see the politics in that agenda. But in any event, I'm pleased, as I said at the outset, that we do have a jobs bill that I think will have an impact coming to the floor this coming week, the patent reform bill, which I think is essential. As it relates to the precluding of America's defaulting on the obligations it has incurred, I appreciate what the gentleman has to say, but of course the rating agencies, 3 agencies now, which have said we stand at risk of losing our AAA rating, which America has always had, does not distinguish between how we get to where we have a vote of approval on allowing America to pay its bills. I, too, like the gentleman from Virginia, want to reach an agreement on the reduction of the deficit and the substantial reduction of the debt. The gentleman indicates he wants to cut spending by trillions. However, as we all know, and I've repeated, the gentleman voted for a rules package the first day of this session, which provides for $4.8 trillion in additional deficit without paying for it. That is the continuation of taxes while not cutting the spending by that amount. You precluded our continuing to provide for statutory pay-go applying to revenues as well as expenditures. Both obviously have an impact on the deficit that we incur. We incurred substantial expense during the Bush administration. As you know, some almost $3.5 trillion of deficit spending, or $2.5 trillion depending upon where you count some of the expenditures, but in any event, a minimum of $2.5 trillion, which we didn't pay for. And we therefore increased the debt by 86% in those 8 years of the Bush administration. Both of us agree that we have to abandon policies of buying things without paying for them and of spending beyond our means. I would hope that we could join together in accomplishing that objective. But I would sincerely urge the gentleman and urge all of us in this House to ensure that in the next few days, literally, we have less than 21 days of legislative time remaining before August 2nd. Urge all of us to ensure whether or not we can reach agreement, and I hope we can reach agreement. But surely I would hope the gentleman would agree that allowing America to default on its bills is not an acceptable alternative, even if we can't get to agreement. We want to get to agreement. I want to work with the gentleman to get to agreement, but allowing America to default on its bills should not be an option. I yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. I would just underscore the sense that the gentleman, Mr. Speaker, says that the markets are watching. I believe that is the case. I also believe the markets are looking for us to enact real reforms, real spending reductions. So by just acting to increase the credit limit of this country without following through in our commitment for spending cuts and reform is just checking the box and is reckless. That's why I say to the gentleman, it is important for us to come together, to walk together, to make sure that we are able to execute on a plan to reduce spending once and for all and to reform the system here in Washington so that the markets understand we mean what we say. And it's time for us to make the tough decisions now and not to just stall and say we'll do it later. The people of this country have seen that over and again, and they're tired of it. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The tough decisions, however, are not to pretend there's a free lunch. What we buy, we need to pay for. And if we don't want to pay for it, we shouldn't buy it. Now, frankly, that didn't happen under each one of the budgets that we adopted from 2001 to 2008, the 2009 budget. It didn't happen. We spent far beyond that which we paid for in those budgets. And that took a $5.6 trillion deficit, surplus projection, to a almost 100% turnaround and an over $10 trillion projected deficit. I just say to the gentleman, I agree with him. We need to make the tough decisions. We may need to make the tough decisions on cutting spending. We need to make the tough decisions on paying for what we buy. Hopefully, we will have the courage and the wisdom on both sides of the aisle to do just that. I yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. I hope we also have the courage and the wisdom to focus on what it is the people sent us here to do. They sent us here to focus on jobs and the economy. Yes, we take seriously our responsibility to get the fiscal house in order. But if the priority is about jobs, we know jobs don't come from government programs overall. They come from the private sector. Over half the people in this country work for small businesses. The amount of small business startups in this country has been anemic of late. We've got to focus on that and ensure that we're responding to what people want. That is, they want more growth in this economy and they want to get back to work. That should be our goal. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments, and I agree with him. What they need is a confidence in the management at the federal level of the finances of our nation. They had that confidence in the 90s when we had balanced budgets. They did not have that confidence in the last decade, and our economy shows the result. I certainly share the gentleman's view that if we can give them that confidence, our economy will grow and jobs will be created. I'm for working together to accomplish that objective. I yield back the balance of my time.
The Chair will entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise? Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the 14th Annual Congressional Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Expo and Forum going on until 4:30 p.m. in the Cannon Caucus Room. The theme of this year's Expo is Efficiency plus Renewables equals Economic and National Security. There are 57 exhibitors, including the United States Air Force. They all have displays. I encourage everyone to go and see the Expo before you leave for the day. In addition to the House and Energy, Renewable Energy and Efficiency caucuses, we partnered in hosting with the Sustainable Energy Coalition and sister caucuses, the House Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition, the House Algae Energy Caucus, the House Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Caucus, the House High Performance Building Caucus, the Green Jobs Caucus, as well as the Congressional Peak Oil Caucus and the Oil and National Security Caucus. I want to give special thanks to my colleague from Maryland, Congressman Chris Van Hollen, who is a veteran co-chair of the House Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Caucus, and Ben Bosong. This event would not have been possible without the efforts of Mr. Bosong and the Sustainable Energy Coalition. Please go to the Cannon Caucus and see the great exhibits there. 57 exhibitors, including the United States Air Force. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revising and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today with a heavy heart to pay a debt of gratitude to a life of service and sacrifice by one of Indiana's bravest. Scott Davis of Muncie, Indiana, was a devoted husband, father, and a firefighter. Former Yorktown fire chief, he'd been with the Muncie Fire Department since the 15th of June, 2005. Tragically, yesterday, firefighter Scott Davis was killed fighting a fire at the Tabernacle of Praise Church in Muncie, Indiana. He would become the first Muncie firefighter to give his life in the line of duty since 1955. Those who knew Scott Davis were not surprised at the boldness and bravery that he displayed in the Tabernacle of Praise fire, where he fell. He bravely sacrificed his life protecting the community, and in so doing, Scott Davis will forever be remembered as a hero and as a servant leader. In the midst of this great tragedy, I honor firefighter Scott Davis, and we should also take a moment to remember each and every man and woman who serve in volunteer and full-time fire departments around this country. We should always remember and be grateful for those who run in when others run out. Today, we remember Scott Davis, a devoted husband to his wife Roxanne, a loving father of 3, Jake, Emma, and Max. From my family to yours, we offer our deepest condolences and those of the people of Muncie, Delaware County, and the 6th Congressional District of Indiana. The service and sacrifice of Scott Davis will never be forgotten.
Are there any further requests for 1-minute speeches? For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to request to address the House for minutes and advise to extend my remarks to that subject.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today and with another remarkable opportunity to recognize Texas A&M University. This past Saturday, in an unprecedented third straight national championship, was won in track by both the men and women's teams. The Aggie men and women's track teams both run the 1,600-meter relays to give them their third consecutive national titles at Drake Stadium in Des Moines, Iowa. This makes the Aggie track program the first in collegiate history to win both men's and women's team titles in 3 consecutive outdoor seasons. The amazing talent, depth, and teamwork displayed by these athletes helped the team overcome obstacles and a shaky start to finish strong with a phenomenal win. I commend Coach Pat Hidry for his outstanding leadership in guiding the Aggies to victory and for becoming the only coach to accomplish a triple-double of NCAA championships. I also recognize Athletic Director Byrne for his second and third NCAA national championships at Texas A&M this year. I'm honored both as an alumni and as a member of Congress to represent such an accomplished and well-deserving university. Congratulations and thank you to the hard-working men and women of the Aggie track teams, to Coach Henry, and to the loyal fans of Texas A&M University for making history. Gig 'em and great job.
The Chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. John Larson of Connecticut for today.
Without objection, the request is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, most Americans remember 1 year ago tomorrow, President Obama and Vice President Biden launched what the White House enthusiastically called the Recovery Summer. This was supposed to be a 6-week-long push to highlight what the Obama administration said would be jobs created last summer by a surge in federal stimulus spending across the country. Senior advisor to the President, David Axelrod, said, and I quote, "This summer will be the most active Recovery Act season yet, with thousands of highly visible road, bridge, water, and other infrastructure projects breaking ground across the country, giving the American people a first-hand look at the Recovery Act in their own backyards and making it crystal clear what the cost would have been of doing nothing," end quote. Yet, the only thing that's crystal clear to the majority of Americans is that there is nothing to show from the Democrats' failed economic policies that have set our country on a road to ruin. Since President Obama has taken office, he has done absolutely nothing to promote American energy production. He's done nothing to reduce the regulatory burdens on small business owners. He has done nothing to fix the tax code to help job creators. He has done nothing to increase the competitiveness for American manufacturers. And he has done nothing to pay down America's unsustainable debt burden and to bring back confidence among investors and entrepreneurs by supporting long-term American growth, American economic growth. And now, President Obama is selling the sequel to last year's recovery summer sales pitch and kicking off this summer by trying to convince the American people that 28 consecutive months of unemployment above 8% is just a bump in the road to recovery. In addition, a number of Democrats are calling for billions more in taxpayer dollars to be spent on yet another wasteful stimulus to create jobs, but Americans aren't buying it. Unemployment is nowhere the 6.8% level at which the administration claimed it would be today if the stimulus was signed into law. When Americans' promise and prosperity and security for future generations is at stake, this cannot be brushed off as just a bump in the road. It is a mountain of constraint put in place by a litany of failed Democrat policies and unfulfilled promises. And what's worse is that President Obama recently laughed off the fact that his stimulus projects, which are costing taxpayers trillions of dollars, have failed to live up to their promise to create new jobs. Democrats promised this would be the summer of recovery, but their conflicting assessment of the economy and their double talk has left American families wondering, is this a joke? Well, most economists and the American people are not laughing. Their concern is growing, and confidence in President Obama's economic policies is plunging more and lower every day, and the idea of another stimulus is dead on arrival in the House. In the face of the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression, this administration and the Democrats in Congress are choosing to play politics with economic recovery and continue with another round of empty rhetoric and unfilled promises in their desperate sales pitch again this summer. House Republicans are serious about creating real American jobs, and we're making it our mission to put Americans back to work. We know that what we need are common sense policies that will create jobs in this country immediately. We cannot let this administration have another frivolous shot at wasteful spending of taxpayers' hard-earned dollars, or be given more regulatory power or allowed to spin its way out of the catastrophic economy the Democrats have created with empty phrases like recovery summer. House Republicans have produced a pro-growth, pro-job creation budget, as well as a real plan for America's job creators. Both plans will put the nation on a fiscally sustainable path to restore confidence, lower tax rates, and allow America to remain competitive in the global economy. We want to take the burden of regulation off our job creators and produce more American energy so that Americans can start receiving the paychecks that they need and deserve. And we want to reduce the hostility of the federal government's regulators toward American business, both small and large. We cannot allow this out-of-touch administration to continue with their failed experiments and silly punchlines. We cannot allow Washington Democrats to tax and spend away the futures of our children and our grandchildren. We cannot continue down the road to ruin, Mr. Speaker. Coming from the private sector to Congress, I know that America can and will become prosperous beyond imagination, and millions of new private sector jobs will be created if we would just get back to our founding free market principles and end big government and wasteful spending. It is time we take a different road this summer, Mr. Speaker. We cannot continue on the misguided and irresponsible path endorsed by the other side of the aisle of higher taxes, reckless spending, bigger government, explosive debt, crippling regulation, higher deficits, and unacceptably high unemployment. 81% of Americans know somebody without a job. As a matter of fact, if you look at the unemployment rate that includes underemployed and unemployed, almost 1 out of every 5 Americans is unemployed or underemployed today. Under President Obama's watch, almost 40,000 jobs have been lost every 2 weeks. President Obama's so-called stimulus was signed into law 28 months ago, and there are nearly 2 million fewer Americans with jobs today. They have had their chance to make things right last summer, and it has not worked. Now it is our turn. These are undoubtedly tough times, and I want to continue the great American legacy of leaving our children better off than we ourselves are. It pains me to know that only 17% of the mothers in this country believe that their children will be better off in the future. It doesn't have to be this way. There has not been a more important time in our nation's history to realign our principles and policies in light of current economic reality. As the son of a hard-working rancher in the Texas Panhandle, I always reflect back to those tough decisions and sacrifices that my family made around the kitchen table. We had no choice but to live within our means. Every day I remember these life lessons, whether I'm balancing my family budget or making an important decision for my constituents. I must represent the best in terms of taking care of our country's fiscal health. We must make tough decisions on spending, on tax reform, and on reducing our nation's debt. And we must remain committed to spurring economic growth and job creation. We must do this, and most importantly, because we owe it to our children and our grandchildren, so that they're afforded the same American promise and prosperity and security that we were when we were born. Mr. Speaker, about 3 months ago, my wife and I had our first granddaughter. We want that girl, when she grows up, to have the same opportunities to live the American dream that we had when we were born. And, Mr. Speaker, before I close, I'd like to ask our American people to remember our country in its prayers during these difficult times, and also to remember to pray for our military men and women who protect it daily. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
I yield back. I did.
We're almost at 90.
We'll give him 30 seconds.
No, we're almost at 90.
Yeah. I recognize the gentleman from Texas for a motion.
Mr. Speaker, if I may continue, I have additional remarks.
The chair recognizes the speaker, the gentleman from Texas only for a motion.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Speakers announced policy January 5th, 2011. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the privilege to be recognized here on the floor of the House of Representatives and to address you about the issues that are important, I think, to you and all of us who serve in this United States Congress. And as we know, the American public watches the work that we do here, and sometimes we need to send a message along on how we would like to hear that work interpreted. Today, I would take up 2 or perhaps 3 subjects, and one of them is a piece of legislation that is an amendment that I offered on the Agriculture Appropriations Bill that did pass the House of Representatives today and became part of the bill as final passage. And that amendment was an amendment that had language in it that prohibited any of the funds in the bill from being used to support the telemed components of this, which are used to distribute RU-486, or the legal drug name for RU-486, which we know, Mr. Speaker, is an abortion pill. It has become a practice in Iowa where Planned Parenthood is using Iowa as an experimental state to do what I call Skype robo-abortions. That is this practice of, under the Food and Drug Administration regulations under RU 486, they're required to have a physician present who can conduct a number of emergency procedures, if necessary, to examine the patient. And Planned Parenthood has circumvented this. They've clearly violated the intent of the regulation. I believe they literally violate the regulation of the FDA on RU 486, the abortion pill, and are setting up and have set up and have been practicing what I call Skype robo-abortions. In other words, a young woman who is pregnant would go to a Planned Parenthood center in Iowa, sit down in a room where there's a computer screen monitor in front of, on a desk that has a drawer in it, usually, and there are a number of different practices. A physician who might be 1,000 miles away is on the other end of the computer internet connection, and this physician would then ask questions of this soon-to-be mother. And once she answers the questions to his satisfaction or her satisfaction, the physician's satisfaction, there's a button pushed, a little drawer opens up, and the abortion pill rolls out and is there for the individual to take the pill where she's advised, go home now, and your body will go through some significant changes and will expel this little baby. This is Skype robo-abortions, and under the grant program that is facilitated by funding within this Ag Appropriations bill, there have been already some grants that have been offered and presented to Planned Parenthood that have been administered by the Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius's agency. And I know this, Mr. Speaker, because I headed up a letter that was signed by 70 members of Congress asking for the documentation in form from Health and Human Services. Are you providing grants to abortion providers, Planned Parenthood specifically? That answer was yes. And are these grants for telemedicine? And that's the category that's in the bill. In the bill, an Ag Appropriations bill that just passed this House, there's $15 million for telemedicine. Telemedicine is supposed to help so that we can do diagnosis or remotely diagnose, not so that we can do remote Skype robo-abortions. And so the amendment that passed here clearly says you can't be using any of the funds for telemedicine that would be used to distribute or used to facilitate the RU 486 abortion drug. And there's a little more precise language than that. Mr. Speaker, I want to make it clear that I put the precise language into the record last night during the debate on that amendment, the precise language which is the congressional intent for this amendment. There is no misunderstanding, however, Mr. Speaker, since Planned Parenthood also scored this vote and also interpreted it in the way that I have just stated. So I just simply clarify this into the record that these funds under this appropriation bill will not go to telemedicine grants that could be used for the purposes of facilitating the Skype robo-abortions that I've described. And I'm grateful to the House of Representatives for a significant majority to pass that amendment. I'm grateful for the strong pro-life majority that this Congress now has. The position that this Congress has, which is and has taken it a number of times, that it is, a lot of us believe, immoral. Some others won't take that position, but they say it is unjust to compel taxpayers to fund abortions or to fund the facilitation of abortions through their tax dollars. In a way, it's the majority in this Congress now, this pro-life majority in this Congress, that has given the American taxpayer the voice of conscientious objection to federally funded facilitation of abortions. I'm grateful that this Congress now has this majority. I'm grateful that they put this vote up again today, and there have been multiple votes in this new Congress that express the very sentiment that I've just expressed. So I'm expressing, Mr. Speaker, my gratitude to the House of Representatives and my commitment to continue forward down this theme until we can one day see an end to the ghastly and ghoulish and gruesome procedures that sometimes are described as women's health services. They are not, and they're not good for women's health either, Mr. Speaker. And so then I would transition into the Second Amendment that I offered last night, that the vote was rolled on until within the last couple of hours here in the House of Representatives, and that was the amendment that addressed the Pigford Farms issue. Now, this issue is about the class action lawsuit that was filed by a gentleman by the name of Timothy Pigford in the aftermath of an announcement that was made by then Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman in 1995. The Secretary of Agriculture in 95 said that it admitted that the USDA had been discriminating against black farmers. That opened the door for a class action lawsuit. The class action lawsuit's been known as the Pigford suit because it was Timothy Pigford that filed the suit and his claim that he was discriminated against. I believe that he has been at this point compensated, but I don't have a way to prove that because the records for Pigford are sealed. Congress at this point can't get at the records for the settlements in the largest class action lawsuit in the history of the United States of America. But here are the numbers, Mr. Speaker. The numbers work out to be this. In 1995, in anticipation of and negotiations with a consent decree on the black farmers discrimination case of the Department of Agriculture against that there's the discrimination of them against black farmers. They anticipated 3,000 would be the sum total universe of the black farmers that had been discriminated against who might file under the Pigford class action lawsuit. 3,000. That's out of a universe of 18,000 black farmers. Now, whenever you're going to look at the potential for how many applicants there will be, you first look at the total universe to determine then what percentage you think of the total universe would be filing claims and would actually have a claim. Well, the 3,000 was surely calculated as, I think, 1/6 of the overall total universe of 18,000 black farmers. They must have thought then, in an informed judgment, that 1 out of 6 black farmers had been discriminated against and would file. Well, it didn't turn out to be 1 out of 6 black farmers. It turned out to be about 1.5 out of every black farmer that filed under Pigford 1. Not quite 1.5, but there ended up being 22,000 and some odd claims with black farmers. So out of that came 15,000 and some settlements of, we believe, $50,000 at a minimum. And that, Mr. Speaker, was a number of claims that were greater than the number of actual black farmers. Now, I don't have a problem with carrying this debate when I look at a universe of 18,000 and I see that 22,000 and some filed a claim. Surely, some of those that filed a claim were not farmers, and surely some of those who filed a claim had not been discriminated against. It took both of those standards in order to pay out, presumably. In any case, Pigford 1 was resolved. $1.05 billion was paid out under the Pigford claim of discrimination against black farmers. $1.05 billion with a B. I found out about this when a USDA employee who had been deployed to Washington, D.C. in the very late 90s or maybe early 2000 came back home and was sick to his stomach that he had had to distribute these millions of dollars to people that he believed 75% of them at a minimum had filed a fraudulent claim. Many of those applications, he brought back the copies of those applications and presented them to me and said, please do something. This is an unjust payout of people that allege that their victimhood of discrimination who were not farmers, never wanted to farm, didn't know where the Farm Service Administration office was, the USDA office was, but yet they had been recruited to file the claim. And at least 75% fraudulent. So I took all those applications. To tell you, Mr. Speaker, I was blurred by it. I couldn't quite absorb all the implications by just reading the application and hearing the description of the individual that brought this back. He's not the only one. There are a number of others who willingly have come forward now and are willing to testify, and some of whom, especially in other states, that were directors of the Farm Service Administration who participated in the administration payout of the first $105.05 billion. But since that time, Pigford 1 was closed. It was then extended again for any late filers to get in, and then closed again. That's where we ended up with the 22,000 and change. After that, Mr. Speaker, there was an effort that was brought forward here in Congress by Arthur Davis of Alabama in one initiative, Bobby Scott of Virginia in another initiative, to open this up under Pigford 2. There was also an initiative in the United States Senate. One of the people that introduced standalone legislation to open up Pigford 2 was Barack Obama himself as a United States Senator in the year 2007. And the bill that he introduced was S-1989. That legislation didn't go anywhere. It didn't have a single co-sponsor by my recollection, but it put the marker down. There was a very urban senator from Chicago who was engaged in opening up a second round of Pigford when in Illinois, the state that he represented, and truly he represented all of Illinois as a United States Senator, there were only 78 black farmers in the whole state. But the payout was 100 to 153 people. And that's just a little snapshot measure of Illinois itself, without going to break this down county by county and looking to see, surely, I mean, it is certain that there were more claims paid out in Pigford than there were black farmers in Illinois. And probably, well, I'll say that's not necessarily true in every single case in every single county, but we know that's the case for Illinois. At any rate, it became a political tool in my view. And as they tried to open up Pigford 2 in the House, it didn't pass the House. And when it did finally pass the House, it didn't pass the Senate. And finally in the Senate, during the lame duck session, late last fall, actually November 22nd, there was an action that put the Pigford issue in together with the Cobell issue and the other Native American claims on a bill called the Claims Act. The Claims Act included TANF funding, the Temporary Assistance to Needy Family Supplemental that went in with the Claims Act. All of this that was out there, the Pigford case didn't fit. But my back channel information tells me that the President ordered that Pigford be attached to the Cobell and Claims Act, which they did in the Senate. And because it rode along on a piece of must-pass legislation, it passed out of the Senate, was messaged over the House in November of last year, and passed after the election so that the discredited Congress, the lame duck Congress, voted to now appropriate another $1.15 billion into Pigford 2. That, Mr. Speaker, goes on top of the Farm Bill, which was a 2008 Farm Bill, and I do better thinking about this chronologically. But in 2007, when we discussed and debated the Farm Bill here in the House, the chairman of the Ag Committee at the time, Colin Peterson of Minnesota, provided for and supported language in the Farm Bill that carved out a $100 million authorization for a second round of Pigford. And when I objected, and I said, Mr. Chairman, that will open the door for $1.3 billion in additional money to go into that fraudulent Pigford claim, his answer was, no, it's $100 million, that's the end of it, that's the limit, that caps it, and that settles all outstanding claims. You don't understand, this is the end of it, and it makes sure that it's done and it doesn't open up the door beyond $100 million. We had a disagreement. Some would call it an argument about whether that opened this up to $1.3 billion, which is what I said. That was my assertion, Mr. Speaker, or whether the then chairman of the Ag Committee was right in that $100 million was the cap. Well, in any case, we know now who was right, because there's $1.25 billion in the pipeline for a second Pigford claim. $100 million of it was in the Farm Bill, and $1.15 billion of it was stuck into the Claims Act. And how did that number get arrived at? According to the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, he told me that I voted for the Farm Bill and directed him to go negotiate with the black farmers in a means of trying to put an end to this so that it limited the potential liability of the federal government. Well, no, when you go back and actually look at what happened, I voted no on the Farm Bill coming out of this House because, in part, it had the Pigford $100 million in it. Nonetheless, and the language is there that says this is the end. This is to resolve all outstanding, unresolved claims over Pigford, $100 million. As the chairman of the Ag Committee, Colin Peterson has asserted that's the language that's in the bill, but the Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack and the Attorney General, Eric Holder, took that and somehow interpreted the plain language of the bill to direct them to go open up a second Pigford claim, which now turned into an additional $1.15 billion on top of the $100 million that was in the 2008 Farm Bill. And now, where we started out with 3,000 potential claimants, 3,000 projected claimants to Pigford 1, which would be the total sum of the claims, out of a universe of 18,000 black farmers, now we have 94,000 claims, Mr. Speaker. 94,000 claims that have risen to the bait of $1.25 billion additional dollars. And I point out, Mr. Speaker, that if you just round that to the nearest tenth of $1 billion, I was spot on in my prediction that it would be a $1.3 billion door that was opened by the $100 million in the Farm Bill. It has come to pass just as I have said, slipped in, forced in, pushed in, partly by the President of the United States. I believe at his directive. Certainly he was delighted to sign it. And according to the Secretary of Agriculture, he believes he was directed by the Farm Bill to go negotiate with the black farmers and open this up and ask for an additional $1.15 billion. The language limits, it doesn't empower. But he claims also the authority to negotiate in any case, and that the Attorney General has the authority to negotiate in any case. So here we are. When I asked the Secretary of Agriculture who's been disciplined for perpetrating a total of $2.3 billion of discrimination against 94,000 people who claim to be black farmers, who are they? Who's been fired? Who's had charges brought against them? The answer, after a few questions, is no one. Think of this, Mr. Speaker. $2.3 billion worth of discrimination allegedly brought against black farmers, agreed to apparently by the Secretary of Agriculture and the Attorney General, and they're looking for justice, and they can't find a single perpetrator of discrimination, and they're the ones that hired them. The checks go out today to employees of the USDA under the guidance of Secretary Vilsack, and not one of them can he uncover as a discriminator perpetrator as even a part of the $2.3 billion that they allege was discrimination that took place. Not one perpetrator on his payroll, even though every perpetrator had to be on his payroll or the payroll of his predecessors. They can find 94,000 victims where only the universe of 18,000 exists, but he can't find a single individual that perpetrated discrimination. And we are to believe in the United States Congress that somehow this is just an example of where government went wrong and discriminated, and we're trying to right a wrong with a checkbook that comes from money borrowed from the Chinese and goes to people that could not have been farmers in the first place, could not all of them been discriminated against. And I'd go further, that we have a whole list of discrimination claims that come from a county where the supervisors in the USDA office were all black. It's kind of hard for me to get my mind around how it could be racial discrimination of people by the same race against people of the same race. That's a little hard to define. When when the Irish go at each other, they don't call it racial discrimination. So just to put that in a metaphorical position so that people understand it clearly, Mr. Speaker, I am very concerned that too many members of this Congress understand how much fraud exists in Pigford. and they just don't want to put up the vote. They just don't want to put up the words to correct this and call it what it is. And I'll say that the fear of being accused of not having the will to face a difficult subject matter is superseded by the fear of being called a racist, so they walk away from it. I believe this: we must have equal justice under the law. We cannot continue to be a great country unless we continue to have equal justice under the law. That means that you deal with people without regard to their race, their ethnicity, or their national origin, or their gender, by the way, or their disability, or their age. All of those things are immutable characteristics. And so, well, almost all of them are immutable characteristics, but it's defined clearly in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, Mr. Speaker, and broadened in some of the civil rights sections that take place within our states, which I abide by and live by. But we cannot, Mr. Speaker, be a great nation if we're always going to shrink away from difficult subjects. If we are going to pay out borrowed taxpayer money, we're borrowing 42 cents on every dollar. Some of that money is borrowed from the Chinese. Some of it's borrowed from the Saudi Arabians. And we would take that money and borrow it and hand it to people and say, please don't raise a fuss. I know that you are a minority, therefore you must have been victimized at some place along the line. This is being sold and marketed in the South in a number of different ways. Fish fries in the South, sometimes in black churches in the South. And they say to the people that attend those kind of gatherings things such as this: you know, you don't have to be a farmer. If your granddaddy was a farmer, you're a farmer. If you're the grandson of a farmer, you were discriminated against because surely somebody discriminated against your grandfather, and surely he would have been a rich farmer had they not done that, and surely you would have inherited the farm or some of the money that he made from that, so you've been discriminated against. If your granddaddy was a farmer, you're a farmer, you file, it's natural that you were discriminated against. The regulations and the standards on this, the proof is so low that all an applicant has to do is allege that there was discrimination and then find someone who will attest, someone who is not a close family member, who will attest that they complained about being discriminated against. So, Joe and George can get together and say, let's go file mutual applications and allege that we wanted to be farmers, we were discriminated against, and we complained. Automatic $50,000 check goes to them out of the borrowed money of American taxpayers, along with a $12,500 check that goes to the IRS to pay the tax liability. And they had the temerity, some of them, to complain that they weren't also getting their estate tax waived. So the money that would be settled goes into the estate if someone dies, obviously, and they didn't want to have to pay estate tax on their inheritance. Now, we can have a $1 million exemption, a $3 or $5 million exemption. They still don't want to have to pay the tax beyond the exemption. That is not just temerity, that's audacity. And another component of this, Mr. Speaker, is this part, that the largest civil rights class action lawsuit settlement in the history of the United States is Pigford. The single individual who's received the greatest settlement from that is Shirley Sherrod. Shirley Sherrod, the former USDA employee, whom the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, hired 3 days after she received news that she was going to receive $13 million in her claim against Pigford. That was on July 22nd. He hired her on July 25th. And later on, when a speech that she gave before the NAACP came to light, then the Secretary fired her like that. I don't believe that that was an act that was his decision alone. I find the Secretary to be a wise, smart, and a careful, well-prepared man. However often I disagree with him. I believe that order came from the White House. And he tried to hire her back. It didn't work until some weeks ago. Now she's back on the payroll, having filed a lawsuit against who? The guy who published the truth, Andrew Breitbart. These are all things that this Congress needs to get to the bottom of, Mr. Speaker. This Congress needs to, if we have to, subpoena the records, go through the 94,000 applications, sort them, chart them, evaluate them, bring people under oath, gather testimony, do a complete investigation of what I believe is the fraud that's been perpetrated against the American taxpayer, and done so within several different administrations. Some, I believe, was motivated for less than stellar reasons. And I think whenever someone has been discriminated against, in these cases, we need to make them whole if we can. I support that. I think we did that for almost all of them in Pigford 1. And I think we made a bunch of people whole that did not have it coming. And then, by legislative shenanigan and action of the White House, opened up a Pigford 2 that put the taxpayer on the hook for an additional $1.15 billion. Now that sums up to $2.3 billion, Mr. Speaker. $2.3 billion, 94,000 claims where there's 18,000 black farmers and an expectation of only 3,000 claims altogether. Not a single identified perpetrator of discrimination. And Congress can't look at the records. Congress can't get a straight answer. A Freedom of Information Act request is denied by the USDA because it's sensitive. But the USDA releases as public all of the information that goes in farm subsidies. That's out there, and people go on the website and complain about the farm subsidies that are there. Why, if you're a farmer, should the subsidies that come to your operation be public knowledge, but if you are one who has alleged you've been discriminated against, your records are secret, even from the United States Congress? That's all wrong, Mr. Speaker. We know that. The conscience of this Congress has spoken today. 152 of us have spoken up, and I think the foundation for legitimate hearings has been heard. And so I appreciate your attention, Mr. Speaker, and I would at this point, not seeing another speaker arrive, pause for a moment and see if I could inquire of the speaker if there's an anticipated speaker.
I'm uncertain. The chair's uncertain at this point. We're going to wait a little bit, and then...
Could I inquire how much time I have remaining?
Gentleman's time has expired.
That was my suspicion, and so I'll stand by for the allotted period of time. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker?
Let's just get one piece of it. Okay. Yeah, do we not have any papers?
No. I don't think so.
Chair would be pleased. The chair would be pleased to entertain a motion to adjourn.
You want to speak?
I would like to ask to address the House. Who wants to do this? I didn't know that.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer, is recognized for 30 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, June 5th, the state of Texas and our nation lost a true hero. Chief Warrant Officer Brad Gaudet was killed in Afghanistan after his helicopter crash near Kabul. Brad was the best and brightest of what the 1st Congressional District of Texas has to offer. Raised in Lufkin, Texas, and a graduate of Stephen F. Austin University, he was truly a son of East Texas. General MacArthur once said, "Duty, honor, country. Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be. They are your rallying point to build courage when courage seems to fail, to regain faith when there seems to be little cause for faith, to create hope when hope becomes forlorn." For Brad, these three ideas were not just to strive for. He understood them
He embodied them. He lived them. Brad, just 31 years old, was a husband, a father, a son, and a brother. Outgoing and aggressive, Brad truly personified the Army's old slogan, "Be all you can be." The summer before his senior year in high school, Brad joined the reserves and went to boot camp. His family joked that he was never more prepared for the upcoming high school football season than he was that year. Upon graduating from Stephen F. Austin University in Nacogdoches, Texas, Brad enlisted in the Army and was sent to Fort Rucker in Alabama. There he pursued his dream of flying and graduating from flight school. The next stage of his military service brought him to Fort Drum in New York, where he met the love of his life, Jenny. During his second deployment, Brad achieved pilot in command rank, a highly skilled specialty officer, which is very difficult to achieve for those who were not commissioned officers. This speaks to his hard work, his outstanding training, his performances, the respect his superiors had for him. A true family man, last month, Brad rushed home from his third deployment in Afghanistan just in time to help with the delivery of his newly born daughter, Addison. His family will always remember his great sense of humor, his infectious smile, his kind heart, and his desire to brighten anyone's day. Today, I want to extend my prayers and condolences to Brad's wife, Jenny, his two young daughters, Teely and Addison, his parents, his relatives, his friends. Their American warrior is home. He has met his Maker, his Master. His duty is done, and he is at peace. George Orwell said, "We sleep safely in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to visit violence on those who would do us harm." Our grateful nation is so very proud of this son of East Texas. We grieve the loss of our warrior brother. We honor Brad for his courage, his sacrifice, and his selfless commitment to duty, honor, and country. He gave his all in service for the sake of safety, freedom, and liberty. May God bless the sacrifices and the last full measure of devotion that Brad Gaudet paid. And may he bless us all because of such a patriot. Now I would like to, Mr. Speaker, address a bit about...
The gentleman will suspend. I would just ask the observers in the gallery to please refrain from applause.
I'd like to address myself for a moment to Afghanistan. It's where Brad Gaudet and so many Americans have fought, have died. It was the place where the Taliban flourished. They trained terrorists. They prepared for the chance to come kill thousands of Americans in New York City. They came up with plans to kill Americans in other places in the United States. So it was important that we go take out the home bases of the Taliban. For those that know the history of our fighting in Afghanistan, they know that what we initially did was send in advisors and trainers and people to help the Afghans to fight and take out the Taliban. And in fact, a group that proved most helpful was the Northern Alliance. Some say it's run by warlords, but these tribal regions with their leaders accepted munitions, accepted training, accepted what it took to bring war upon the Taliban, and they whipped the Taliban. At least until later the Taliban resurged. But after the Northern Alliance defeated the Taliban, we did something that I was not aware of until some of the warlords or Northern Alliance leaders wanted to sit down with somebody from our government, and our State Department, they said, had refused to meet with them. Well, these were the leaders of groups who risked their life. Many in their groups lost their lives fighting the Taliban and whipped them. And when my friend Dana Rohrabacher said, hey, these folks want to meet with somebody from the U.S. government, the State Department won't meet with them, will you go with me? I said, sure. Initially, we were going to try to meet near northern Afghanistan, but when the Uzbeks found out, as I understand it, they didn't want to give visas to these people. We thought maybe we'd meet in India, and they didn't want to give them visas. And so at the last minute, we arranged to meet in Berlin. 5 of the 9 did meet. And something that many Americans don't realize, the Taliban, in preparing for 9/11, knew that there was a man who was charismatic, who was a powerful leader, who had the chance to bring together Afghanistan as a nation, Afghans as a people, even though it's so very tribal. One person had the chance to really pull it all together. And on either September 9th or September 10th of 2001, he was boldly assassinated, so that when a day later 9/11 occurred, there would be nobody that the U.S. could really turn to as one individual to rally Afghans against the Taliban. They took him out before they committed their act of atrocity against Americans. They knew what they were doing. They planned well. But our American soldiers know what they're doing. And when we sent special forces, intelligence folks to help, they were able to whip the Taliban. And I didn't realize until we met with these Northern Alliance leaders that after they initially whipped the Taliban, we demanded that they disarm. According to them, they were told, look, we're the United States of America. You have nothing to fear. We're here. We'll make sure that you're not harmed. You fought for us. You whipped the Taliban. It was our mutual enemy. And so turn in all of your weapons. I said, you turned in everything? And he said, well, we've got, some small arms. We can't fight the Taliban with the little bit we've got left. We gave all of that back, plus some of our own. And the Taliban has resurged. The war has gone on much longer than it should have. There are reports of corruption. The poppy production has surged much more than anything else there in Afghanistan. And what they had heard was that our government was negotiating directly with Karzai, the nominal leader of Afghanistan, and with Pakistan. And what they had been hearing was that our government was negotiating indirectly with the Taliban itself that want to destroy America. And the word that they had gotten was basically that the United States just wanted out, and if they would let us get out without a major incident, then between the Taliban, Karzai, Pakistan, they could just divide things up however they wanted. I want our troops, I want our people, I want our resources out of Afghanistan, but we've got to make sure that people like Brad Gaudet and so many others that have given their lives haven't done it for nothing. But it seems that that initial success may have given us a good roadmap to how you succeed in Afghanistan. Equip the people that are our friends, who have the same enemies as we have, and let them do the fighting. Things went well when that's the way it went. We provided trainers, advisors, gave them some intelligence, and they whipped the bad guys for us. What would be wrong with getting back to that point instead of what the rumors are that this administration is prepared to do? Let the Taliban take back up where they left off once we leave. Does anybody think that if the Taliban gets a foothold again, as they want to do, Al-Qaeda gets a foothold, radical Islam gets a strong foothold in Afghanistan again, does anybody really think they won't come after us again? They've pledged that we're a great Satan, that we must be eliminated. The most free country in the world, the greatest country in the history of mankind, and these people want it destroyed because it doesn't fit into their narrow scope of having a global caliphate where one religious leader dictates to everybody. We kind of like our freedom, where those of us who are Christians are free to worship, and those who wish to worship any other way are free to do so. That's America. But it's not time to just cut our losses and leave. It's time to act smartly. And I am very much afraid this administration will continue to reward our enemies and to turn against our allies and friends. You can't keep maintaining foreign affairs and any credibility in the world when you turn against your friends, thinking that your enemies are going to like you better because you showed you'd turn on your own friends. Your enemies don't like you any better when you turn against your friends. In fact, what happens is they not only don't like you, they no longer respect you, because some in the world, they don't like us, they hate us, they think we ought to be destroyed, but they respect our power. And once they see that a nation will turn against its friends and hurt its own friends and allies, they know this country should not even be respected. And as I've said many times, we don't have to keep paying people to hate us. They'll do it for free. It's time to quit paying our enemies to continue to nurture hatred against us. It's time to be a true friend to our allies. We heard one of the greatest speeches I've heard in my 6.5 years in Congress from that podium right there, and it didn't come from any State of the Union. It came from the leader of Israel. We heard from Palestinians. They thought the speech was a declaration of war. It means they didn't listen to the speech. Because as Prime Minister Netanyahu made very clear, as soon as the Palestinians are willing to tell their people there will be a Jewish state of Israel, peace can be worked out very quickly after that. But no one wants to say that on the Palestinian side. And so, as Patrick Henry said, men cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. And there will be no peace in the Middle East. And here, we think that, gee, at least this administration, we hurt our friends, our enemies will love us. They've been trying that since the Clinton administration, when the Clinton administration classified an anti-Khomeini and Ahmadinejad, as of now, group called MEK, their initials. They're an anti-totalitarian regime group, and there are over 3,000 residents of the Camp Ashraf in Iraq. We as a nation gave them our sovereign promise, we'll make sure you're safe and secure. When we turned things over to the elected government of Iraq, we were assured by that government that they would take care of that promise and they would keep the residents of Camp Ashraf safe. And yet, I guess nearly a week ago, when a group of 6 of us met with the Prime Minister of Iraq there in Baghdad and tried to discuss the issue of the Iraqi military going to Camp Ashraf and killing over 30, perhaps 35 residents of Camp Ashraf, wounding perhaps 100 or more. From reports, from a video Dana Rohrabacher had seen, he says it's very clear these were unarmed civilians that were killed by the Iraqi military. That's not the promise we made to those people in Camp Ashraf. It's not the promise that the Iraqi leaders, including Maliki, had made to those Iranians in Camp Ashraf. And yet, the Iraqi military killed civilians in Camp Ashraf. As I tried to explain to Prime Minister Maliki, when he said for us to be concerned and try to do something about the killings would be a violation of their national sovereignty, I tried to explain that actually it does involve sovereignty, but the U.S. sovereignty was involved in promising their safety at Camp Ashraf. And his sovereignty was involved when they promised the safety of those residents at Camp Ashraf. So we have a vested interest with all of the American lives and treasure that were laid down and invested in Iraq. We have a very strong vested interest in seeing that justice is done and that people that made promises to us keep those promises. Because if we don't see to that, then how can we expect anyone to trust us? How can we expect anyone to truly negotiate fairly with us, expecting we'll keep our word? Sometimes you make bad deals, but if you're going to keep your word and you're going to be known for being a country and a people of honor and a people of their word, you got to keep your word. As a former judge and Chief Justice, some things I've seen have been unjust. But when we can do something about it to help us keep our word to those who trusted us, we got to do it. We can't look back. So we were a bit surprised when our group of 6 members of Congress, 4 Republicans and 2 Democrats, we flew up to Erbil, met with folks up there. It's always good to see troops around, American troops, the best I've ever seen. The 4 years I spent in the Army, starting in the late 70s, left me concerned that if we were attacked back in those days, we were in a lot of trouble. But the military I see and I meet and visit with, those from my district, from all over the country, so impressed me, that so impressed those around them. We have an incredible military these days of our servicemen and women. When we left Erbil up in northern Iraq, we're flying out, we got word that our embassy had been contacted by Prime Minister Maliki and told that our group was not welcome in Iraq any longer. I have attended far too many funerals of people from Texas and other funerals of Americans who laid down their lives and in doing so provided people like Prime Minister Maliki the chance to come back from exile, to be elected in that country, and to be a leader I don't think it's too much to ask for a little gratitude. We're not asking anything in return. I know there was some discussion, wasn't from me, about, gee, maybe you could help us instead of doing deals with China for your oil after we secured your country and got rid of the tyrant Saddam Hussein. Maybe you could do with us. I'm not asking for those things. I'm just asking for a little gratitude for the lives and the treasure that were expended to give people in Iraq the freedoms they have today. And I expect people who have become leaders in Iraq to keep their word to us. Because if they can't be trusted, if they won't keep their word, well, they can lock me out of their country all they want to, but we have the power of the purse. I didn't join in the lawsuit against the administration over the war powers. I think it's well intended, dear friends that are involved in that suit this week. I didn't engage in that as a party for one reason. This body has the power constitutionally of the purse. We don't need a War Powers Act. We don't need any interpretation by the Supreme Court of whether the war powers is effective or the war powers is not, because we have the ultimate weapon in this body called the power of the purse. And if the President wants to send our American treasure and our American military, which composes 65% of NATO's military, what a joke to say, hey, we're turning it over to NATO. We won't be involved anymore. We're 65% of NATO's military. If we're going to have a president that sends people over there, not because Congress thought it was a good idea, not because a majority of the American people did, but because the Arab League asked us to, and some in the UN thought it was a good idea, then Congress has the ultimate power, and we don't need the war powers to do it. We don't need the Supreme Court's okay. All we have to do is shut down every dime being spent in Libya until such time that we can be sure that whoever takes over Libya will not be worse for the United States than the crazy murderer that's there now. We need to be sure of that. And I know the President made the mistake one day of saying he had visited all 57 states, and I'm well aware that there are not 57 states in this country, although there are 57 members of OIC, the Islamic states in the world. Perhaps there was some confusion whether he'd been to all 57 Islamic states as opposed to all 50 U.S. states. But nonetheless, we have an obligation to the 50 American states, not the 57 Muslim Islamic states. Our oath we took is in this body, in this House, and it's to the people of America. And it's not to the Muslim Brotherhood, who may very well take over Egypt. And once they do, they are bent upon setting up a caliphate around the world, including the United States. And this administration will have been complicit in helping people who want to destroy our country, out of the ignorance to think if you help your enemies, they're going to like you better. Not only do they not like you, as I said, they disrespect you when they see how foolhardy you are. It's time to quit involving this country in warfare around the world unless we can be sure that such warfare helps us keep our oath to the United States of America. And to quote my dear friend from Texas, also a former judge, and that's just the way it is. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The chair